Welcome to the chapter on action types. Now, I'm just going to say up front, if there's any chapter in this program that you can feel free to skip, it's this one. So if you're already kind of getting over your head and you just want to continue on, feel free to skip this one. It's not going to confuse you, but it's just kind of unnecessary knowledge. Because the simple fact of the matter is that you could go your whole career as a private citizen understanding how the weapon that you purchase works, and that's enough. But that said, you may find yourself in an argument with somebody someday who carries a handgun that utilizes a slightly different action type, which we're about to talk about, and they might try to tout the benefits of the one they use. It would be nice to be able to defend yourself, or at least not to have your confidence shaken. Ooh, did I get the wrong gun? So if you want to stick with it, feel free. We're going to talk about the three main different action types that encompass just about all self-defense handguns out there, which are single action, double action, or single action / double action, all in one pistol. If you don't want to watch this chapter, just rest confident that 95% of the semi-automatic handguns out there, regardless of action type, work in the way that we've already established. Where you put the new magazine in, you cycle the slide to chamber a live round, and then once any manual safeties are disabled, you simply pull the trigger until the magazine is empty. That said, the actual mechanics of how that is achieved can sometimes differ. And so, with that said, let's dive into the different action types. Some of the most popular handguns on the market today fit into the single action category. For a handgun to be considered single action, either the internal or external hammer must be cocked prior to every shot. Now, there are single-shot, single-action firearms, and there are semi-automatic single-action firearms. Single shot implies that for every shot, you must manually cock the hammer, as was the case with the old 19th century revolvers, such as this one. Single action semi-automatic implies that the normal handgun function is to utilize the recoil following every single shot to automatically cock the hammer, just like we've talked about several times now. It's still considered a single action pistol though, because the hammer does have to be cocked before you shoot it, right? But that happens automatically when we're talking about semi-automatic handguns. And thus, even a modern semi-automatic pistol, such as this Glock, fits into the single action category. Now, some people further classify pistols that use a spring-loaded striker as being striker-fired, rather than something that uses a spring-loaded hammer. But, just so you know, there are very, very few differences between these two mechanisms. And regardless, the overall function of that handgun is still correctly described as being single action. And so when you hear striker fired, just know that the striker is simply synonymous with hammer. It just looks a little bit different. It's the same thing. The key, once again, is that for a pistol to be in the single action category, the firing mechanism must be cocked before you begin pressing the trigger. And so, how do you know that you're dealing with a single action pistol? Well, if you cock a pistol on an empty chamber and press the trigger, and then you hear the resulting click, and then you try to press the trigger again, but the trigger just remains pressed to the rear and nothing happens, then you're dealing with a single action handgun. If, however, you cock the pistol and you press the trigger and you hear the click, but then you're able to let up on the trigger and press it again and hear another click without cocking anything, then you're dealing with the next type of action, which we'll talk about now, the double action handgun. The next most common type of action mechanism in a handgun is known as double action, or double action only, which is abbreviated DO or DAO. In these pistols, rather than the hammer already being cocked before the trigger press can begin, it's the actual act of pressing that trigger or pulling the trigger which pulls the hammer backward. You see the difference there between single action and double action? In these double action only guns, the hammer never is truly cocked. Instead, there's a portion of the trigger press that pulls the hammer to the rear, and when the trigger reaches a critical point in its pull, the hammer is then released, which then hits the firing pin, which of course detonates the cartridge. And so the key identifier of a double action only handgun is that the gun does not need to be cocked in order to begin pressing the trigger and to make the gun go off. And so how can you tell if your handgun is of the double action type? Well, we just talked about that, but once more, if you obviously make sure your handgun is unloaded, but then you cock your handgun, and then you press the trigger and you hear the click, if you then are able to let up on the trigger and do nothing else but just begin pressing it again and get another click and another and another and another, then your gun is a double action handgun. That's because without cocking anything, the trigger just keeps on dropping the firing pin on an empty chamber. The final type of handgun action that you may encounter is called the double action, single action handgun. These types of handguns combine both action types because, like the semi-automatic single action firearms, the recoil function of the handgun is what automatically cocks the hammer. However, like the double action only handguns, this isn't required because you can also just press on the trigger when the hammer or the striker is in the uncocked position, and the trigger is going to push the hammer to the rear and then release it. You see what I mean? It's both. It's both a single action and a double action. All right, now strong arguments can be made for the theoretical or actual advantages or disadvantages of each of the three action types. They just can. However, here's the reason why you really shouldn't overthink action types. Provided you're buying a handgun that was manufactured by a reputable manufacturer who had good engineers, and provided this gun is indeed being used by police and military around the country or around the world, then that gun is almost certainly doing the job it was designed for. So regardless of what action type it uses, it's going to be using that action type very, very well. And so a tier 1 gun, as we're going to talk about in terms of the quality, or a combat grade handgun, is a combat grade handgun, whether it has a single action mechanism or a double action mechanism, or if it's a combination of both. So that's the main reason why you shouldn't consider these things too much. That said, I will say that a couple of the arguments have a little bit of weight to them. The most credible argument is almost undisputable, and that is that a single action handgun is going to have a shorter trigger pull length, and it's going to have a lighter trigger pull weight. And the advantage there is that it's going to be more easy to fire accurately. Okay? Double action handguns usually have longer trigger pulls and they're a heavier trigger pull weight simply because that trigger mechanism is doing a lot more work than the mechanism of the single action firearm. And so you can absolutely argue that it's going to be easier and more natural to fire an accurate shot from the single action platform. The argument that can be made, and this one is a little less credible for the double action handguns, is that in the event of a misfire, whereas with the single action handguns you have to manually cock the gun to eject the dud cartridge so you can fire another one, with the double action handguns you can just continue pressing the trigger. However, that argument doesn't carry much weight with me because in a combat situation, if a firing pin ever falls on a round and it doesn't go off, there's a very, very, very slim chance that continuing to press the trigger is going to successfully detonate that cartridge. If it didn't go off when the firing pin hit the primer the first time, it's probably barely even touching the primer on subsequent hits because the primer doesn't pop out like a button every time it's hit. The primer is dented in. And so now, as that striker continues to hit, it's just hitting that dent. You see what I mean? So you're going to have to cycle the slide anyway. Now, that doesn't speak for revolvers. See, this is a double action revolver because every single press of the trigger cocks the hammer and releases it. However, with the revolver, every time you press the trigger, a new cartridge comes up for fire. And so if I experience a malfunction with this single action semi-automatic pistol, which is unloaded, then there's nothing I can do. Nothing I can do except to free up my hand and hopefully get to a position during the fight where I can eject that cartridge and then get back in the fight. Is that going to be possible? God only knows. But if you have a revolver, if by chance you're firing, and again, this is completely unloaded, if you're firing, you know, bam, 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 and then dud, you don't have to clear anything. You just pull the trigger again, bam, you got a new cartridge up. So those are just some of the advantages and disadvantages of the various action types, and also that's why you don't really have to think about them too much. Just make it a point to learn your firearm inside and out, and make sure to get enough training on that firearm and practice with that firearm so that regardless of its action type, you are a master of that action type.